Yo, so guys, welcome back to another video. This is another war type reaction. Obviously, this is predicted or projected type war, but it's not stuff that's happened in the past. But the video is wars of the 2020s and the 30s, and this was suggested a few times, and I saw it, and I was interested in seeing the video, and I've come to watch it. This is my first time ever seeing this channel, but I'm interested in seeing what countries he thinks are going to go at war with each other. I assume that's going to be the case, like him predicting what countries, because I'm guessing there's sort of countries that have got tensions with each other already, and maybe he's thinking those tensions will boil over. Hopefully it's not countries like the US, Russia, North Korea, because if them three countries like went at war, the world is finished. So I'm praying, and even like Great Britain, any country that has a nuclear weapon, just please don't use it. I'm praying. But yeah, I'm interested in seeing this video. And I mean, I'm not even going to rabble. Let's get into this one. Quick shout out to my Instagram and my Twitter, links in the description. Same for my second channel, links are all there for those interested. But let's get into this one and let's see what this video is about.
The last 80 years have been called the Long Peace, in that since the Second World War, there's been no major wars between important industrialized countries.
Shit.
This is not the norm. The history of the world is effectively the history of war. Nearly all the countries in history have been in a permanent state of waging war or preparing for the next war.
It's true, man.
The periods of peace, whether the
Very
Pax
true.
Romana or the Long Peace of the 19th century, have been precious respites.
Pax Britannica, I can't even say the word. Pax Romana. So that's like the Roman Empire, I assume. And that's Pax Britannica. I'm thinking when the UK had all the colonies it had, but Britannica, I've never heard that term.
Normally caused by one military power being so preeminent as to making war idiotic for anyone else. For a variety of reasons which I mentioned in a previous video, the international scene is showing immense tension. The possibility for any of many wars breaking out in the near future is going up. This is a video to talk about the possible flashpoints for a conflict in the next 15 to 20 years. I'm not expecting all of these wars to break out, and some won't happen in the 2020s or 30s, with this video awkwardly stretching in parts to mid-century, but it's the best we can do when predicting the future. This expects to make a general overview of the highest possibilities for conflicts. A lot of the specifics at how these wars would be fought and who would win I'll cover in a future video about World War III. So with that done, let's start.
Welcome to... Oh, this is the channel. Shout out to this guy as well, actually. I'm excited to see his video style.
The world today is an absolutely fascinating place, and one that's in flux at that. It's really hard to keep track of all the various currents taking place because everything is moving so fast. Should we be focusing on China, the Middle East, the US election, or Africa? Well, Magellan TV is a great start. Founded by filmmakers, Magellan TV is a documentary streaming service
Getting
with
his
a
money,
rich
you know how it is,
geopolitics
man.
section.
Come on, bro. Deserve it. Getting his plug in. That's good
On
to see,
life in
man.
these war zones, and a lot of it covers conflicts you've probably never heard of, like insurgency in Thailand and the Philippines. It's really food for thought that thousands of people are dying for causes and in wars today that few of us have ever heard of. Besides this, Magellan is the best history documentary content anywhere. It has videos on topics ranging from the ancient world to the present, alongside biography and the Second World War. It's compatible with basically any device and is 4K with no additional cost. Click the link in the description and learn about whatever inspires you today.
Part 1, Water Wars.
This is the one that worries me the most. As global population, and especially people's standards for quality of life around the world rise, tensions over resources is basically inevitable. This is compounded by global warming, which in gross simplification makes the Arctic wetter while the tropics drier, resulting in more water scarcity in some very populated regions. Of all the topics involved here, water wars tend to be the most intractable and the most likely, since, in general, for the countries involved, the water is an existential issue they're willing to die over. As upriver nations dam up the rivers, under most circumstances, a war is very likely unless there's some variable I can't see. This amounts to an issue of survival for many of the downriver nations, which will do anything and everything to keep what often amounts to their only water supply. If a downriver nation loses their water supply, they effectively lose their independence at best, and at worst are simply erased from existence. The first example of a war like this is the Ethiopia-Egypt water dispute. Ethiopia is building the Renaissance Dam to block up the Blue Nile, blocking Egypt's water supply. Just for some statistics, Egypt is 95% dependent on the Nile for its water supply, and so the 10% decline in the Nile's river water that's projected could see Egyptian farmland outside the delta decline by 30% and in the delta by a quarter. Hydropower losses could be up to 30%. Some studies show a 46% decline in agricultural land as a relatively plausible option. Remember, this is a country where a significant percentage of the population are subsistence farmers. Ethiopia's incentive here is that this dam would provide enough cheap energy to power the entire nation of Ethiopia, as well as much of Sudan. In fact, bribing Sudan with electricity, the next nation downriver by the Nile, is what resulted in Sudan siding with Ethiopia in this issue against Egypt. Similarly, Sudan is much less dependent on the Nile due to a combination of natural higher rainfalls and aquifers. There is an element of a proxy war here, with Iran and Turkey supporting Ethiopia, while Israel, the Gulf Arab states, and Saudi Arabia are Egyptian allies. In a direct war, none of these nations would likely get directly involved. At the end of August, Egypt and Ethiopia failed to reach an agreement, which means Ethiopia will press ahead without compromise from Egypt. This has resulted in the US pulling aid out of Ethiopia, which was more of a Chinese ally anyway. Neither of these countries are world powers, and thus are under the influence of the great powers. Ethiopia would probably stop building the dam if China, their paymaster, bullied them enough, but China doesn't have a reason to do this. Also, Ethiopia is experiencing immense internal issues, with a good possibility of civil war in the near future. With the rebellion of the
God damn, that's a country that's out full war, man. That's
Tigray
crazy.
tribal group, which would delay or prevent this issue for a good while. Egypt, with its historically abysmal military, and which currently has absolutely no military projection ability to fight across Sudan and Ethiopia, would lose the war. Ethiopia is also a mountainous country with a reputation for being difficult to conquer and the people really hard fighters. If the Nile is dammed up, it would be the worst humanitarian crisis in history. Egypt has a population of 100 million, and even if 2%, a ridiculously conservative number, were to be displaced, then that would already be one of the bigger refugee crises in history. If the more probable number of around 30 million would be displaced, that would be a crisis large enough to completely change European civilization. Europe would have to become anti-immigration and completely change its ideology or stop existing. The second region with water-based politics is the Tigris and Euphrates, which flows through Iraq from the headwaters in Turkey. Turkey is currently damming both of these rivers, which, like Egypt, Iraq is practically entirely dependent upon. In my live streams, I've said many times before that I think Turkey will be a great power in the future. Turkey is currently expanding in every direction, and Iraq is likely part of this. Control of these rivers would grant the Turks control over this entire region, which historically isn't that surprising, since this region has always been controlled by massive multi-ethnic empires, with the Turks controlling Iraq for the vast majority of the last 1,000 years. This, in fact, isn't that different from the general principle of irrigation empires, but on a broader scale. Irrigation societies are nearly always god-king aristocracies with grinding poverty for the vast majority of the population, with the single river basin united, since whoever controls the centralized water system has control over the entire region and can starve any dissidents of water.
It's actually crazy how much power water can have. It really is. But the importance of it to humans, it does make sense why, but still, Ethiopia, why are they doing this? Are they doing this so they have more water for themselves? Are they doing it in spite, like, towards Egypt? I guess it's to sort of benefit their own country, but still, when you're going to hurt so many people from nations nearby, it doesn't make sense to why, but each country has their reasons for certain things, but obviously this is something that's crazy. And you can see why this would lead to a bigger sort of issue because of so many countries being allies with the other countries, and it's just like, yeah, this could go totally wrong. And with it being built, it's worrisome for sure.
However,
and it's crazy because I never even heard about this issue before, but now I hear it, it's like, okay, now I see why this is going to create such
This
chaos.
time, rather than being the god kings of Sumer or Akkad, the people in charge of the water are the Turks. Moving east, another region to worry about for water wars is Central Asia. Tajikistan is damming up Uzbekistan, another desert nation's water. Central Asia is really interesting in that it's a competing battleground between Russian, Chinese, Islamist, and local authoritarian interest groups. However, the overriding variable is the doubling of population since 1990, which creates immense pressures upon the local environment. This is combined with the drying up of the Aral Sea, which has further desertified the local environment. This is combined with stagnant economic growth and a brutally oppressive political system. Of all the areas in the world, I'm most worried about Central Asia, in which all these variables coalesce. Something very bad will happen soon in Central Asia. I just don't know what. I've heard some scenarios in which Uzbekistan would take the gloves off, conquer much less populous Tajikistan in order to secure their water supply, and then become a regional hegemon based around the greater Uzbek identity. This is possible. Uzbekistan is militarily, demographically, and logistically far ahead of its neighbors, but I'm not sure it's enough to pull it off. An issue with that is that Uzbekistan, being at the center of the map, if it decided to become a great power, would provoke the wrath of China, Russia, and possibly a more powerful future version of Iran, who would crush them, which brings another possibility that this region gets cannibalized by one of the great powers. An equally plausible scenario is one in which the whole region collapses into chaos, sort of like the Middle East before 2011, given that, in abstract, the conditions are remarkably similar between the two given situations. The fourth, and in my opinion, by far the most horrifying and deadly water war is that between India and China, in which the Chinese are building 300 dams in their border with India in the Himalaya mountains in order to strangle India's source of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers. China's not willing to negotiate on this, and 1 billion people are dependent on these rivers, meaning this is an absolutely horrifying prospect lingering over us. A large portion of this comes from a Chinese position of weakness, with much of the north of China projected to run out of water in 2030. The North Chinese Plain is actually relatively well watered, all things considered. However, this is more caused by the massive water needs of their industrial sector, and the amount of their water that's polluted afterwards. However, if China can secure India's water and doesn't just cut it, they could basically use it as a bargaining chip against the Indians to effectively turn India into a Chinese puppet state. The Chinese have done wonderful geopolitical work with surrounding India. Pakistan, Nepal, Burma, Sri Lanka, and Iran are all now Chinese allies of some flavor. India is the only anti-Chinese holdout in South Asia, and thus, if it falls, it will effectively give China control over the vast majority of the continent of Asia. India is also an American ally, and if India and China were to get into a war over the water, America, knowing that India by itself would lose a war against China very badly, would side with India in order to keep India strong and thus prevent Chinese hegemony over Asia. An Indian-Chinese water war could easily become a world war, not to mention just how brutally horrifying this war would be. For example, India and China are both nuclear powers, and combined have populations larger than the entire worlds during World War II. The casualties would easily be the worst in history of any war.
Aging wars.
What did it say there? Worlds during World War.
So world population 2.4, India, China today 2.8.
The casualties
with populations this big, World War II, 60 million deaths could be
would easily be the worst in history of any war.
Aging war. So what's this going to be then?
In the centuries to come, Russia and China's decades of communism will be seen as a major turning point in history, since it wrought long-term shifts to both nations that will effectively become time bombs unless dealt with. A really big one of these is demographics. Communism was very effective at keeping nations poor while lowering their birth rates. You've seen this under every area that was under communist control for more than a couple decades. For example, under Stalin's reign, Russia's average birth rate per woman went from 6.5 children to 2.8, and then went beneath replacement levels in the 70s. Similarly, China's one-child policy resulted in a horrifying situation of having every generation. I
swear their one-child policy led to like people just giving their children away or just like killing them. Maybe that's extreme, but I swear I remember hearing that because they wanted a certain gender, which is, wait, what was it? What did he say? Like, people wanted more males than females?
Similarly, China's one-child policy resulted in a horrifying situation of halving every generation. You see, the correlation between urbanization and birth rate is pretty high. Once societies get more urban, people have less kids. In general, this results in the wealthy nations having older populations, but at the same time being rich enough to support them better. Communism did the foolhardy thing of prematurely forcing people off the farms into the cities while the economy was still poor, which resulted in poor and old societies. For example, the average American from a wealthy country is younger than the average Russian or Chinese person, much poorer countries. The politics of aging are that the elderly are effectively a societal drain that they consume and don't produce, while the young are the opposite. But when the young reach a certain critical mass, political instability results. In recent years, Europe's geopolitical impotence and the Middle East's endless civil war.
The average age around the world, the average age of like Central African countries is under 20. That is so scary, man. That is so scary. Because obviously that means people die very, very young there. That is messed up, man. I mean, I do remember learning about this in geography, but that's just scary when you see that. The average age of... I feel like the higher the average age, the better, but I might be wrong with that. And you got certain countries like in Asia, then the yellow. So you got certain countries. You got India, which is a big country. You got like some of the Arabian countries, Mexico, some South American countries. Green is what I'm interested in. So a lot of Europe is green. Some part like Japan, South Korea. I'm actually surprised that the US and Australia aren't green, but maybe that's to do with other issues. But when you see that, that is absolutely mind-blowing.
Wars have much to do with the politics of aging. However, the Russian and Chinese elites know that they only have so much time to act before their populations become so elderly they won't have enough young people to have effective military states. In China, this is even more acute in that the Chinese economy is dependent upon its cheap labor that it exports to the rest of the world. China is dangerously close to reaching the middle income trap, in which one isn't rich enough to be a domestic consumption-based economy, and not poor enough to use cheap labor as an advantage in the global marketplace, with an aging population, which is the worst possible combination. Russia, meanwhile, is situated in a flat plain with no defensible boundaries and thus must use its size in of itself as its biggest advantage. Russia has always used its massive population as cannon fodder to make up for its lack of defensible borders, but what happens once Russia's population is neither large nor young? This is why Russia and China are currently acting so aggressively. Both know they have a limited time frame to become stakeholders in the global system in order to start racking in the rent before their retirements kick in. Expect Russia to act very recklessly in the years to come. The current Belarus crisis is the perfect opportunity in which the discrediting Lukashenko creates the perfect opportunity for Putin to step in and bring order, which would have him enact the planned union state between Belarus and Russia. I don't think Russia will have a war with Europe, but if it were to be caused by anything, it would be an aggressive Russian action resulting in a miscommunication that would spiral into war due to Russia's desperation. Much of China's Belt and Road is to create a young subject population across Asia that they can sell goods to. As China's population ages, it can sell goods to the developing young populations across Asia and Africa. Or at least that's the plan. China is completely dependent upon food, natural resource, and oil supplies that come by sea, almost all of which come through the Straits of Malacca. This means the Americans, as the preeminent naval power, basically have a trump card. A big reason the Chinese are trying to build the Belt and Road is in order to create a land-based order by which they can transport everything they need, such as food and oil, by land over Central Asia rather than by sea. A big issue here is that if China can actually find a way to knit Asia together by land, it will unite a majority of the human race. This would be a
Wait,
death blow.
what?
The big issue here is that if China can actually find a way to knit Asia together by land, it will unite a majority of the human race.
Oh,
This
wow.
would be a death blow to the American-European naval-based world system, which carries the vast majority of the world's trade. There is a precedent to this, where for the vast majority of history, the center of the world wasn't the oceans, but Eurasia, and so a return to this wouldn't be abnormal. Whether China can become or survive as a great power is in a large part determined upon whether it can build this Eurasian.
The US-China trade war. Who dominates global trade? Who is the largest trading partner? I mean, you look at that now, and China has a huge majority.
Trade alliance before their aging crushes them. The Chinese elite knows this, and that's where the danger lies. Africa has the exact opposite issue of this, in that they have had massive population growth and a young population with borders that make no sense, entrenched self-serving elites, and not enough economic growth to justify it all. If this sounds familiar, it's what's resulted in the last 10 years of death in the Middle East, but Africa has all the issues above, but worse. I mean, you just can't look at projections that say stuff like Lagos in Nigeria is supposed to have a population of 30 million in 2050, in a country with practically no infrastructure, exports to pay for the food, or effective supply chains. The massive slums that would incur would be the perfect breeding ground for disease and political radicalism. When you see this across the whole continent writ large, a continent with declining amounts of water due to climate change, and without the economic or systemic growth to support the numbers involved, you have a catastrophe waiting. I'm just not sure if this will strike in the 2020s or 2030s.
I can't say that. Thucydides traps.
There's this idea of Thucydides trap, by which the...
How do you say it? Thucydides. How did he say it?
Just not sure if this will strike in the...
Thucydides.
There's this idea of Thucydides trap, by which the dominant power will try to crush the
Thucydides.
rising one, before the rising one becomes powerful enough to overpower the dominant one.
Okay, I see that.
The quintessential example of this is the Peloponnesian War, in which the war broke out since Athens was developing quickly and would overtake Sparta unless Sparta did something first. In the book by Graham Allison of the same name, 15 examples of it were shown in the last 500 years of European history. 12
Look at the UK doing it so many times.
Resulted in a war. It's often used as a tool to describe the US's relationship with China, by which China gets more powerful by the day, while the US stagnates by comparison. This means that it's inside the US's self-interest to crush China before it gets significantly more powerful enough to threaten the United States. This has validity, but another way of looking at it is from the perspective of the previous section, by which China will be crushed by aging population, while the US has stable population growth. The issue we run into here, and we've faced before in the history of the world, is that, like high school, the nations and people's insecurity often have little knowledge of others' insecurities and weaknesses. The prime historical example of this was before World War I, in which the British and French were worried that the Germans would overtake them if they did nothing, while the Germans were worried that the Russians would overtake them if they did nothing.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the Russians and Austrians were worried that if they did nothing, their empires would get torn apart by modernization and ethnic nationalism.
It's just crazy how that just defines the human race. Each individual country is worried about the other one surpassing them, so they have to do things to stop that from happening, and then it leads to wars and stuff like that. I mean, you can see it from the past, like World War One. Why this could be the case in the current day, because these kinds of issues are still the case.
This resulted in mass insecurities and recklessness on the part of European governments, which resulted in the First World War. People fail to realize that the First World War didn't start due to chance or madness. It was a series of tiny rational decisions of self-preservation that collectively killed everyone. A very similar issue is occurring today in that the Japanese, Indians, Americans, and Vietnamese are worried that if they do nothing, they will be crushed by China. Similarly, the Chinese and Russians have the population insecurity mentioned above. Under similar circumstances, the Turks know that they're in a region with massive aging populations and decaying economies, With their young and booming economy, they can start throwing their weight around in a big way. North Korea is the apex of this. Their regime knows it's a relic of another age living on borrowed time, and so is desperately trying to invest in nuclear weapons in order to bully the outside world into concessions that will keep itself alive for a few years more. North Korea, meanwhile, is a Chinese ally, and so if the Americans were to invade it, it would result in American troops on the Chinese border. This would be unacceptable to Beijing, and we all know what happened last time that happened in the 50s. In its immense weakness, North Korea is a major danger to the geopolitical world. There is a very different kind of time pressure that's created by the sudden rise of coronavirus. For reasons explained in the previous video, most of the world's population was barely getting by due to the rising cost of living. When this was compounded by the COVID economic crisis, it created massive, desperate populations. Desperate populations have historically tended to go into two directions, either towards internal strife or external wars. Governments often turn to external opponents in order to unite the nation, or try to use war as a way of changing the rules of the international system to their favor in order to make their populations wealthier and their countries more powerful. The incentive to do this rises as internal strife grows. China is very much the apex of this, in that the reason the Chinese Communists...
China is involved a lot, man. I mean, I knew it was a growing economy, a growing power, but to this level, there's a lot of sort of worries about it from other nations, which is something I didn't expect to be to this sort of extreme.
Party continues to rule China while communism collapsed everywhere else.
Yeah, that is crazy. It was literally like, well, not all over the world, but it was in very large... It was like in the 1980s to now, it's literally what, in like 5 different countries? What, Cuba, China, Vietnam, and I don't know those 2 nations there, but
since the communists made an implicit deal with the Chinese people, by which, in exchange for higher wages and a better standard of living, the Chinese people would agree to accept all the repression and corruption. With the economic slowdown incurred by the trade war and coronavirus, this basically destroys the raison d'etre for the communist regime. For example, China has stopped pushing for their Made in China 2025 initiative, which was effectively based upon stealing Western technology and using it to make their economy a high-tech and quality production center, since the West cracked down on Chinese technological theft, thus making the plan untenable. This is likely part of the reason that China is currently going through a new wave of repression and trying to instigate ideological fervor, and that they're trying to keep their population under control after they stop providing their side of the deal.
The decline of American hegemony.
It sounds really rich coming from an American, but the era of American hegemony has been the greatest age in history.
I can't read. What does hegemony mean? I come across as so stupid. I've never heard this word before. Alright, so don't come at me for that. Hegemony is the dominance of one group over another, often supported by legitimating, norms and ideas. So I'm going to just say legitimizing norms and ideas. The associated term hegemon is used to identify the actor group, class or state that exercises hegemonic power or that it's responsible for the dissemination of hegemonic ideas. What's an example? Is a leader dominance for one group? Okay, so I see. So this is sort of countries. Okay, I see.
I don't mean to be chauvinistic, but no matter what metric you look at, whether
so one country trying to keep the power over another kind of thing.
Nutrition, health, literacy, personal freedom, peace, wealth, or national self-determination, it's writ large. This is since the US has agreed to protect a huge number of countries from foreign conquest, which has incentivized countries to work together rather than conquer and oppress.
They've got all the Americas bar what? I forget what country. Is that Venezuela, I think, and Cuba? They've got the vast majority of Europe, and then countries spread out through Africa and Asia and Oceania.
Meanwhile, the US policed the entire world's oceans, thus opening up the entire world to cheap and safe oceanic commerce. The US did accrue many benefits from this, like cheap credit, but These disproportionately helped the American upper classes and hurt the American middle class, which was hollowed out by competition with cheaper foreign workers. American industry and society was hurt by the US creating a world system with which everyone had free trade with America, but most of the world kept tariffs against America. Since those who benefited from the American world system inside America were greatly outnumbered by those who didn't, we're seeing a revolt from inside America against that very system. America feels the need to renegotiate its position of power around the world. What most foreigners don't understand is that America really doesn't need the rest of the world. America has a rate of dependency on the rest of the world's economy similar to countries like Sudan, Ethiopia, or Cuba. The US is a net exporter in oil, food, industrial goods, and basically any other material you can think of. Over the next 20 or 30 years, we'll see the total US removal of power from areas like the Middle East, whose oil the US no longer needs, and the rest of the world, except the first world areas that are wealthy enough
due to the fracking, the US is now an oil
for the US to continue to justify maintaining influence over them. The US will no longer protect the whole world's oceanic traffic in the way it used to. I'm guessing the US will stay in areas like Europe or the Far East, but the US is sick of losing money on maintaining troops in other continents. This will either result in the US starting to take tribute from these regions in one form or another in exchange for America's protection, or these countries start expanding their own militaries. This would start to weaken American control of these regions. Once the French and Germans start to have very good militaries, how willing to listen to America will they be? Another thing to consider is that the only way the US would be able to win a war against Russia or China would be by arming the Japanese, Germans, and Turks to the teeth against them. Arming and militarizing these nations would change geopolitics in too big a way to describe. America's removal would create an immense power vacuum in much of the world. Most African countries, for example, have absolutely terrible militaries, and the only way they haven't been recolonized, collapsed into different countries, or cannibalized each other is that the American world system will crush anyone who does so. That will end. Also, in areas where the countries are weak and have little reason to exist besides a European diplomat said so, they'll be gone. Turkey and Iran secondarily, as powerful, industrialized, populous, and militarized countries that sit in the middle of this, will benefit enormously and build large empires when America stops caring.
That's a scary fucking thought, man. That's a scary thought. And what is it in the next, 10, 20, 30 years this would all happen? Fuck. It's not a positive look for the future.
Similarly, with America no longer protecting Europe's oil interests, you could see European countries, with the prime example being France, Western Europe's most active military power, who already has lots of influence in West Africa, recolonizing or spreading influence in Africa, in order to gain the oil and other resources America's no longer willing to foot the bill for. Well, that was a dark video.
Yeah.
If you liked it, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for more content. Or alternatively, check me out on Patreon, where I've got all sorts of cool maps and the first chapter of my history of the world, as well as my Twitter. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.
Shout out to this guy. It was a good video, but god damn, it was dark. Some of these like possibilities definitely too scary for sure. But let's time to read the comments to maybe brighten my day up a little bit. I remember years ago I was wishing to myself that I could live in more interesting times. The hell was I thinking? I would not call Russia a Chinese ally. Russia and China are both as likely to stab each other in the back. Turks, Germans, and possibly Austrians arming themselves. World War I. I have seen this before. He predicted the rebellion of the Tigray region in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is basically in a civil war now. That's very true. Once more, Latin America is just sitting and watching. 2 days later, Armenia and Azerbaijan are at it. Is that true? See, I don't know about this sort of stuff going on in the world, man. As the father of a 3-year-old, this is exactly the kind of thing that keeps me up at night. Yeah, the future's scary, man. The longer the peace, the grander the next war will be. That's so true. That's what I kind of think. The longer the peace lasts, the bigger when it finally gets to it, when there will be a war, it's just going to be beyond it's just beyond what anyone can actually imagine, especially with this coronavirus stuff. It's definitely accelerated some kind of scenarios like that, man. It really has. The United States of America, Amazon, atom bombs, all of the above. The world, we need to maintain the peace. The major powers, no, we need to complete the trilogy. This narrator sounds like he has a clue, a raging clue. That's what I'm thinking. He sounds like he knows what he's talking about. I think it's pointing to the right. He really does. He seems like he really researches this, which makes it even scarier. Video: Turkey is becoming a major power. Me, that's nice. Remembers I live in the Balkans. Well, shit, here we go again. Haven't watched yet, but I have a feeling China's mentioned somewhat here. The Swiss is just sitting there like, fight. Throughout all of this, the Swiss will always be on their own, man. Just not siding with anyone, which is, that's probably the best stance to take. When you're a country that doesn't have extreme power, just sitting there and just letting the other countries deal with it is what I wish the UK did, honestly. Just sit there and just let the other countries do what they have to do. But, you know, when it comes to it, those sort of more powerful countries will try and get involved and side for what beliefs they have. But it's a scary thought. But for my people out there who are just trying to live life in peace, hopefully you guys are doing well. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this darkish video. And until next time, like, subscribe.